Welcome to the Larson Health Podcast, where we bridge science, nutrition, and functional medicine to help you heal from the inside out. I'm Kim Larson, certified functional nutrition coach, fast like a girl coach, just like I've been going on, and founder of Larson Nutrition and LarsonBotanicals.com. Today, we are talking about post-holiday weight loss. And before we discuss food, movement, or strategy, we need to talk about what actually happens inside the human body during and after periods of increased intake, reduced structure, and heightened emotional stimulation. Because without understanding that physiology, everything else becomes noise. Holidays are not like metabolically unique because of calories alone. They are unique because they combine increased food availability, altered circadian rhythm, right? We stay up later with family, we're celebrating, maybe we don't get as much sleep, or we're busy like shopping for the holidays and getting all the food ready and driving to family to see family. Maybe we have increased alcohol exposure for, many people, not all. I stopped drinking, reduced daily movement, and heightened emotional and physiological stimulation. So when these variables shift together, the body adapts exactly as it was designed to do. It prioritizes energy storage, stress resilience, and survival signaling. It's interesting. And that adaptation is not pathology, it is biology. And what creates metabolic dysfunction is not the adaptive phase itself, but the abrupt, aggressive attempt to reverse it through restriction and punishment without first restoring physiological safety. That is where modern diet cultural fundamentally misunderstands the human organism. Like, our bodies are our temples. We need to take care of our bodies. We need to stop putting in junk into our bodies and listen to what it has. Listen to what it wants. So before we keep going, I want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor, Larson Botanicals. When we talk about the human organism, I always remind people that what you expose your body to matters just as much as what you eat. That includes what you put on your skin and what you're breathing in your home. Larson Botanicals was created around that exact philosophy. Organic ingredient skincare and candles. No hormone disrupting ingredients, no synthetic fragrances, no junk your body has to detox. These are products designed to support a low tox lifestyle, not compete with it. So when people say they are stressed, they are often describing an internal biochemical environment characterized by elevated cortisol, altered sympathetic nervous system tone, suppressed parasympathetic activity, and impaired insulin signaling. And these changes are measurable in blood, saliva, and tissue response. And they have direct downstream effects on fat metabolism. Research published in Psychoneuroendocrinology and the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism has repeatedly shown that chronic physiological stress elevates basal cortisol levels and flattens the normal diurnal cortisol rhythm. So, under normal conditions, cortisol peaks in the morning to support wakefulness and energy mobilization, then gradually declines throughout the day. And under chronic stress, cortisol remains elevated into the evening, impairing sleep onset, reducing growth hormone secretion, and interfering with tissue repair. So, elevated cortisol also directly antagonizes insulin. When cortisol is high, insulin sensitivity decreases, particularly in skeletal muscle, which means that glucose is more likely to remain in circulation and ultimately be shunted toward fat storage. And this is why we don't want to have all this cortisol in our body and our stress, because that's what turns into fat overnight. So, this is not a willpower issue. It is a hormone mediated energy partitioning issue. Cortisol is not only created from stress, but toxins in your home, perfumes, plastics, chemicals in your nonstick pans, in your makeup, your body wash, your shampoo, your cleansers, your toxic cleaners, and more. I'm so intentional about Larson Botanicals. The skincare and candles are made with organic ingredients, thoughtfully sourced essential oils, and absolutely no hormone disrupting chemicals. They're designed to support your nervous system and your skin, not stress them out. You can find these products at larsonbotanicals.com. So, multiple controlled studies demonstrate that individuals exposed to chronic stress show increased visceral fat accumulation even when caloric intake is controlled. Visceral adipose tissue expresses a high density glucocorticoid receptors, meaning it is particularly responsive to cortisol. This is one of the reasons stress related weight gain preferably uh, uh, preferentially accumulates around the abdomen. So when someone enters January already stressed and then adds caloric restriction, excessive exercise, and sleep disruption, they are layering additional cortisol signaling onto an already sensitive system from the holidays. So the body does not interpret this as fat loss season. It interprets it as resource scarcity. So, why restriction after overconsumption backfires? The human body evolved in an environment of feast and famine, but those cycles were gradual and environmentally driven, not physiologically induced overnight or psychologically induced overnight. Modern restriction is abrupt, extreme, and disconnected from true energy scarcity, which creates conflicting signals. Studies examining post diet metabolic adaptation show that sudden caloric restriction leads to a disproportionate reduction in resting energy expenditure relative to weight loss. It's a phenomenon known as adaptive thermogenesis. This means that the body actively reduces energy output to conserve fuel, even when body fat stores are ample. At the same time, hunger hormones shift aggressively. Ghrelin increases, which is your hunger hormone, leptin decreases, and peptide YY signaling is suppressed, all of which increases appetite while reducing satiety. So these changes persist beyond the dieting period, which is why weight regain is so common after aggressive restriction. Importantly, these hormonal changes are amplified under stress. Research published in obesity reviews shows that individuals dieting under high stress experience greater hormonal disruption and poorer long-term outcomes than those dieting under low stress conditions, even when caloric intake is similar. This is why punishment-based post-holiday dieting feels so difficult. The body is not resisting because it is lazy or broken. It is resisting because it is responding appropriately to perceived threat. Recalibration begins with nervous system safety. Before fat loss can occur efficiently, the nervous system must perceive safety. This is not metaphorical. The hypothalamus integrates signals related to energy availability, stress, circadian rhythm, and nutrient intake, then modulates downstream hormone release accordingly. So when the nervous system senses predictability, regular meals, consistent movement, stable sleep, hypothalamic signaling stabilizes. Cortisol rhythms normalize, insulin sensitivity improves, and appetite hormones regain coherence. This is why recalibration works where restriction fails. Recalibration does not mean unlimited intake or passive behavior. It means restoring rhythm before imposing demand. It means signaling to the body that energy is available, movement is expected, and stress is not escalating further. Once those signals are received consistently, fat loss becomes biologically accessible again. One of the most overlooked aspects of post holiday recalibration is glucose stability. During periods of frequent indulgence, glucose variability increases, leading to repeated insulin spikes. Now, why insulin is not inherently harmful, chronic hyperinsulinemia reduces insulin receptor sensitivity over time. Research published in the Diabetes Care and the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition demonstrates that increased glucose variability is associated with oxidative stress, endothelial dysfunction, and impaired metabolic flexibility. This is why I was talking about in the fasting, the 3-day water fast, of how you need to create metabolic flexibility, going in and out of fasting and eating properly. So, metabolic flexibility refers to the body's ability to switch between carbohydrate and fat oxidation depending on availability. When glucose variability is high, fat oxidation is suppressed. That is why stabilizing blood sugar is foundational. It's not optional. Stabilization occurs through predictable meal timing, adequate protein intake, fiber consumption, and post meal movement, all of which reduce the amplitude of glucose excursions and insulin demand. When glucose remains stable, lipolysis, lipolysis, the release of stored fat is no longer hormonally suppressed. So let's talk about movement, walking, and why intensity often backfires after the holidays. To understand why movement is such a powerful tool for post holiday metabolic recalibration, we need to move beyond the simplistic idea that exercise exists primarily to burn calories and instead look at how different forms of movement interact with glucose metabolism, insulin signaling, cortisol regulation, and nervous system tone. The body does not respond uniformly to all movement. And in periods of heightened stress, the type of movement matters for more than the volume itself. So, one of the most consistent findings in metabolic research is that low intensity, frequent movement improves insulin sensitivity more reliably than sporadic high intensity exercise, particularly in individuals experiencing elevated stress or disrupted sleep. So, this is where walking and more broadly non exercise activity, thermogenesis, becomes so metabolically meaningful. Research on NEAT demonstrates that daily movement outside of formal exercise can account for substantial differences in total energy expenditure between individuals, sometimes exceeding the caloric impact of structured workouts. Importantly, NEAT driven movement does not provoke the same cortisol response as high intensity exercise, which means it supports energy utilization without triggering additional stress signaling. So, studies published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism and Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise show that individuals with higher daily step counts exhibit improved insulin sensitivity, lower fasting insulin levels, and reduced markers of systemic inflammation, even when body weight remains stable. So, walking after meals plays a particular important role in glucose regulation, and this effect is not subtle. Postprandial glucose spikes occur when glucose enters the bloodstream faster than it can be cleared into cells. a process that places significant demand on insulin secretion. And skeletal muscle contraction, however, stimulates glucose uptake through insulin independent pathways by translocating GLUT4 transporters to the cell membrane, allowing glucose to enter muscle cells without requiring high insulin output. So I can tell you that after having a meal, so if you can't go for a walk, what you can do is you can take your calves, just with your feet, keep raising up your your calves, and so that will really help, right? So that's going to help you a lot if you can just keep raising up your calves and your just do this for like maybe 5 minutes afterwards, and your calf muscles are actually taking the most out of any muscle in your body, taking that insulin. So it's amazing that you can, like, I had breakfast this morning, I walked around for a little bit, and then I literally, since this podcast is starting, I've been working on my calves. So just an interesting fact. So, human trials published in Diabetic Care and Sports Medicine consistently showed that even short bouts of post meal walking, often as little as 10 to 15 minutes, significantly reduced postprandial glucose excursions compared to prolonged sedentary behavior. So, don't just eat a meal and go sit down. I usually stand up while I'm eating if I can. I'll just eat while I'm standing, and then I walk around. I do stuff around the house, or I go for a walk. Like today, it's raining in Chicago, so I'll walk around the house. I'm doing laundry. I'm packing up all of our stuff. We're going to be leaving Chicago, going out to the suburbs. So all that jazz. So just keep moving after you've eaten. Don't sit down and sit in front of the TV and just watch TV. I mean, so many people eat at their TV and they sit back after they've eaten their meal and just kind of hang out and watch TV and just chill. Don't do that. Go for a walk. Do something around the house for a little while, then you can relax. This mechanism is especially relevant after the holidays when insulin sensitivity may be temporarily reduced due to increased intake frequency, disrupted circadian rhythm, and elevated stress hormones. Walking creates a metabolic environment in which glucose remains mobile rather than being shunted into adipose tissue. And over time, this improves metabolic flexibility, allowing the body to switch more efficiently between carbohydrate and fat oxidation depending on availability. Now, daily step targets on the range of 7 to 10,000 steps have been associated with improved cardiometabolic markers across multiple population studies. But the benefit does not appear to come from any single threshold. Rather, it emerges from the cumulative effect of frequent movement throughout the day, which reinforces that glucose clearance. It supports the lymphatic circulation and maintains mitochondrial activity without overwhelming recovery systems. That's like if they've been talking about like jumping, and then you kind of swing your arms back and forth. I'm kind of making it look like it's silly, but you need to jump around, you need to shake your arms, the lymphatic systems, the rubbing, clear your lymphatic systems, and you're twisting your body to try to clear out, the back and all those muscles, right? Just kind of clear and get moving on your body. This distinction is critical because it explains why individuals who are consistently active at low intensity often experience better metabolic outcomes than those who rely solely on a few intense workouts per week. The conversation around intensity becomes even more important when we consider cortisol dynamics, particularly in women navigating perimenopause and menopause or postmenopause. High intensity exercise, while it's beneficial in appropriate contexts, acutely elevates cortisol as part of the stress response. And under conditions of adequate recovery, this transient increase can be adaptive. However, when baseline cortisol is already elevated due to psychological stress, poor sleep, or caloric restriction, additional cortisol spikes from intense training can impair thyroid signaling, disrupt glucose regulation, and paradoxically increase fat retention. Research examining the interaction between exercise intensity and cortisol response shows that women, particularly in midlife, exhibit a more pronounced and prolonged cortisol elevation in response to high intensity training compared to younger individuals or men. Now, there is something that goes on, right, when we get into our older ages. This is men and women, but particularly women, is our estrogen signaling changes, right? So which normally helps modulate cortisol clearance and insulin sensitivity. And as estrogen levels fluctuate or decline once we're postmenopause, cortisol remains elevated longer, increasing the likelihood that the body will prioritize energy conservation rather than expenditure. This does not mean that intensity should be avoided indefinitely, but it does mean that timing and context matter. So, introducing high intensity exercise before restoring sleep quality, glucose stability, and nutritional adequacy often results in stalled progress and increased fatigue rather than accelerated fat loss. This is one of the reasons so many women report that what used to work stops working in midlife, not because their bodies are broken, but because the internal environment has changed. And a lot of women postmenopause stop lifting weights. You have to lift weights. This is the metabolic change in your body. Muscle burns calories 24/7. 24/7. So you will run warm, you'll be nice and warm, eat some sardines. I just saw a study of this guy who did sardines for 30 days, and now he can walk outside and be negative 20 or 0 degrees out, and he's got no shirt on. There's some kind of metabolic change in your body when you eat sardines. Now, I found that there's sardines that are at Costco that have no skin on them, so they don't have that same fishy taste as some that I found at Trader Joe's. Just an FYI. So, walking and moderate intensity movement, by contrast, tend to lower baseline cortisol over time by activating parasympathetic nervous system pathways and improving heart rate variability. Studies measuring high rate variability consistently show improvements with regular low intensity aerobic activity, reflecting improved autonomic balance and stress resilience. So, this shift toward parasympathetic dominance supports digestion, hormone production, and tissue repair, all of which are prerequisites for sustainable fat loss. Another important and often overlooked benefit of walking is its impact on appetite regulation. Research has shown that moderate movement improvement, leptin sensitivity, which enhances satiety signaling while also reducing stress-driven ghrelin release. This helps explain why individuals who walk regularly often report fewer cravings and better appetite control, even without deliberate dietary restriction. So, appetite regulation is not solely a function of calorie intake. It is heavily influenced by stress hormones, sleep quality, and movement patterns. Excuse me. Almost done with this cold. So, from a practical standpoint, what this all means is that post holiday recalibration should prioritize frequent, low stress movement throughout the day, particularly after meals, before layering in more demanding forms of exercise, because this approach restores metabolic responsiveness rather than overwhelming an already stressed system. So, once glucose regulation improves, sleep stabilizes, and perceived stress decreases, the body becomes far more receptive to progressive overload and higher intensity training stimuli. So, in this context, movement is not being used as a compensatory tool for excess intake, but as a regulatory signal that communicates safety, predictability, and energy availability to the nervous system. That distinction is critical because the body responds not to intention, but to the signals, and signals must be coherent before they can be effective. So let's talk about movement, walking, and why intensity often backfires after the holidays. To understand why movement is such a powerful tool for post-holiday metabolic recalibration, we need to move beyond the simplistic idea that exercise exists primarily to burn calories. Didn't I talk about this already? So one of the most consistent findings in metabolic research is that low intensity, frequent movement improves insulin sensitivity more reliably than sporadic high intensity exercise. I think I might have, yeah. I talked about that already. All right. The conversation around intensity becomes even more important when we consider cortisol dynamics, right? Because as I talked about before, so with the high intensity exercise, particularly for women in post-menopause, and you don't have the protection of your hormones anymore. So that's why a lot of women don't understand is when we're in our 20s, 30s, and 40s, we have a lot of estrogen and progesterone, and these things protect our bodies. And then all of a sudden, these diseases start creeping into our bodies because our hormones are not aligned. And so the baseline cortisol is already elevated due to the psychological stress and poor sleep and caloric restriction and so on and so forth. But yeah, when our hormones are not there, right? The estrogen levels have declined. We don't have the protective effects of that. So it becomes a real problem for us. So that's why walking is so important. So and walking helps at least with the appetite regulation, right? So make sure that you're at least walking, doing some yoga, uh, doing some easy movements, right? So after a meal, go for 10-15 minute walk and get that into your body. So in the context of moving is not being used as a compensatory tool for excess intake, but as a regulatory signal that communicates safety, predictability, and energy availability to the nervous system. So that distinction is critical because the body responds not to intention, but to the signals, and signals must be coherent before they can be effective. So let's talk about protein, meal timing, blood sugar stability, and why structure restores metabolic authority. So when conversations about post-holiday weight loss turn toward food, they often collapse into polarized debates about calories, macros, or dietary identity. Yet the physiology that governs metabolic recovery is far more nuanced than any single framework. So in midlife, especially, the question is not simply how much food is consumed, but how nutrients are distributed, timed, and signaled to the body in a way that restores metabolic competence rather than compounding stress. So protein intake becomes particularly important in this context because it directly influences muscle protein synthesis, satiety signaling, glucose regulation, and resting energy expenditure. As disclosed earlier, anabolic resistance increases with age, meaning that skeletal muscle requires a strong stimulus to initiate protein synthesis. So meaning you need to work out, you need to keep those muscles going, you need to do yoga, you need to do some lifting with some weights and progressively lift those weights. So it requires that stimulus to initiate the protein synthesis. And research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and the Journal of Nutrition demonstrates that older adults require higher per meal protein doses to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis compared to younger individuals, even when total daily protein intake is similar. That has practical implications that are often overlooked. So, spreading protein evenly across meals rather than consuming most of it at dinner appears to improve muscle protein synthesis over the course of the day. So, meaning have, 30 to 40 grams of protein for breakfast, have 30 to 40 grams of protein for lunch, have 30 to 40 grams of protein for dinner. And this way, you're getting into your 100 grams of protein that you need at least a day. And then if you're working out your muscles, you're going for a walk, that all this makes a difference. Studies examining protein distribution show that meals containing approximately 35 to 40 grams of high quality protein are more effective at stimulating muscle synthesis than meals with minimal protein content, followed by a single large protein bolus later in the day. For women in midlife, this means that prioritizing protein earlier in the day is not simply a dietary preference. It's a physiological strategy that counters resistance and supports metabolic health. Protein also plays a critical role in appetite regulation through its effective satiety hormones such as peptide YY and glucagon like peptide 1, while simultaneously reducing post-meal glucose excursions by slowing gastric emptying and moderate carbohydrate absorption. So, research published in the British Journal of Nutrition Obesity consistently shows that higher protein meals improve satiety and reduce subsequent caloric intake without conscious restriction, reinforcing that idea that hunger regulation is hormonally mediated rather than driven by willpower. So, meal timing further amplifies these effects by interacting with circadian biology. Human metabolism follows a circadian rhythm governed by central and peripheral clocks that regulate insulin sensitivity, digestive enzyme production, and hormone release. So, studies in cell metabolism and proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences demonstrates that insulin sensitivity is highest earlier in the day and declines in the evening, meaning that the same meal can produce very different metabolic responses depending on timing. That's why when we have dinner so late at night and then an hour later we go to bed, your body does not have the time to digest that food. So your body is sleeping with that food and then it turns it into fat because your body hasn't moved at all, right? You need to do this. You need to eat earlier, eat your dinner earlier, and go for a walk for 10 to 15 minutes. Do your calf exercises. If you're having lunch at your desk because you're busy at work, do at least your calf raises while you're sitting at your desk. No one's going to know that you're doing your calf raises. And after the holidays, when circadian rhythms are often disrupted by irregular sleep, late meals, and inconsistent light exposure, restoring predictable meal timing becomes a powerful recalibration tool. So, eating meals at consistent times reinforces peripheral clock signaling in the liver, muscle, and adipose tissue, improving glucose handling and reducing metabolic strain. This is not about rigid schedules, but about reestablishing rhythm, which the body interprets as safety. And blood sugar stability sits at the center of this process because glucose fluctuations influence insulin demand, cortisol release, and appetite regulation. So, large glucose swings increase oxidative stress and inflammatory signaling, while also promoting reactive hypoglycemia, which drives cravings and energy crashes. So, research in diabetes care, and the Journal of Clinical Investigation links glucose variability independent of average glucose levels to worsened metabolic outcomes and increased cardiovascular risk. So, stabilizing blood sugar does not require extreme carbohydrate restriction. Rather, it requires thoughtful pairing of carbohydrates with protein, fiber, and fat, along with strategic movement and adequate sleep. A whole food carbohydrates consumed in the context of balanced meals produce markedly different glucose responses than refined carbohydrates consumed in isolation. Like I saw a family member just eating Doritos. That's all they were eating, Doritos. Oh, I love these Doritos. That's all they're eating is Doritos. That is a highly processed carbohydrate. There's no protein in that. There's a bunch of garbage chemicals in that. You need to put protein, eat your vegetables first. So, how we used to do it when we were kids, we'd have a salad first, then we had our protein and our mashed potatoes or whatever we had, or our green beans. Get your if you have a plate with meat and a vegetable and your potatoes, eat your potatoes last. Eat your vegetables first, then eat your protein, which hopefully has some fat, or maybe you have some avocado on your protein or some butter, grass-fed butter. And then you can have your starch. But make sure that you're getting your vegetables, which has also your fiber, and then your quality protein, and then your starch. So, a distinction is supported by numerous controlled feeding studies. This is why elimination based approaches often succeed temporary but fail to produce long term metabolic resistance, as they do not teach the body how to process carbohydrates efficiently. So, tracking intake can be useful during recalibration, not as a form of control, but as a diagnostic tool. It's amazing when you start tracking and looking at, I mean, there's all kinds of apps, you could do it on paper, that you really see, what am I consuming? How much am I consuming? Oh my gosh, when people look at, oh my God, I just had a cookie here, and then I had a cookie there. Oh, and then I had a muffin for breakfast. And then I had a piece of cake for dessert, or and then they just constantly had all this sugar, processed. This is what causes the disease. This is what causes the fat on our bodies, and the the hurt in our joints and in our bones, and the decrease, the increased fats in our body. So research on dietary self-monitoring shows that increased awareness of intake patterns correlates with improved outcomes, largely because it reveals discrepancies between perception and reality. And most individuals underestimate caloric intake and overestimate protein intake. That's why you need to measure it. Get out a scale, get out a measuring cup, particularly during periods of disrupted routine. So short-term tracking provides objective feedback that allows for targeted adjustments without resorting to broad restrictions. Importantly, tracking should be viewed as a temporary skill rather than a permanent requirement. So once awareness is established and habits are stabilized, many individuals can maintain progress without ongoing monitoring. The goal is autonomy, not dependence. And structure serves as a bridge toward that autonomy rather than constraint. Hydration and micronutrient status also play supporting roles in this process. Even mild dehydration can impair glucose regulation and increase perceived hunger, while inadequate intake of minerals such as magnesium and potassium can affect insulin signaling and muscle function. Speaking of, I'm thirsty. Rehydrating consistently throughout the day supports plasma volume, cellular hydration, and metabolic efficiency, particularly after periods of increased sodium and alcohol intake. Like I just went for my function health tests while I had the cold. So they first took 24 vials of blood, and then they took another 4 vials of blood. So I had 28 vials of blood taken between Tuesday and Friday. And I had the cold, and I wasn't eating because I was trying to fast for 3 days. So my body was probably pretty stressed, and I was tired. I wasn't really hungry, but I was battling this cold. Once I ate, I started to feel so much better. Now I ate the right way, right? I had my bone broth, then I had my what did I have next? My kefir, a little kefir. Then I had some steamed spinach with garlic and grass-fed butter. It was so delicious. And then I had some soup with some chicken in it. And it was a bone broth again, but it was chicken and vegetables, and it was delicious. So, going back to sleep, it cannot be separated from this discussion because sleep deprivation alters glucose metabolism. It increases insulin resistance and it shifts appetite hormones in favor of increased intake. Research published in Sleep and the Annals of Internal Medicine shows that even short term sleep restriction increases caloric intake and reduces insulin sensitivity, independent of activity level. So, restoring sleep consistently, therefore, is not a passive recovery step, but an active metabolic intervention. So, when protein distribution, meal timing, blood sugar stability, hydration, and sleep are addressed together, the body receives a coherent message that energy availability is predictable and stress is decreasing. Right. So stress is decreasing, things are getting more stable. This coherence allows metabolic pathways to function efficiently rather than defensively, creating the conditions necessary for fat loss without deprivation. So post holiday recalibration succeeds not because calories are forcibly reduced, but because metabolic signaling is restored. Structure creates rhythm, rhythm creates safety, and safety allows the body to release stored energy without resistance. This is the opposite of punishment based dieting, which amplifies stress and disrupts the very symptoms required for sustainable change. So, thank you so much for joining my podcast today. I hope that you enjoyed this content. If you have any questions, you can always message me and let me know any questions that you might have. I appreciate you joining the podcast. You can reach me at larsonnutrition.com or larsonbotanicals.com. And I'm here always on YouTube, also at the Larson Health Podcast. And you can catch me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and social media. It's so good to see you today and I hope you enjoyed this session. And thank you so much for joining me.